Welcome to the 6th episode in a Legendarium series about the Viking invasions. This episode, The Kings of the Far North, will focus on the rise of Christianity and royal power in Scandinavia, renewed Viking invasions of England in the 980s and 990s, and finally the Viking settlement of North America. By the late 900s, Scandinavia was changing fast. The most successful chiefs had become kings and extended their realms until modern states like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway took shape. To help keep control, these new Norse kings turned to Christianity to unite their realms both politically but also religiously. The conversion of the Norse kingdoms did not go smoothly. Olaf Skotanung, the first Christian king of Sweden, followed the course of the other Norse monarchs of his age, tolerating both Christianity and paganism. However, King Olaf of Sweden had to build the first episcopacy in his country in Skara, rather than his capital of Uppsala, as Uppsala was home to so many pagan temples that locating a Christian church there would have likely meant a religious war. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway brought Christianity to his kingdom with a much firmer hand. During his 5 years on the throne from 995 to 1000, King Olaf Tryggvason destroyed pagan temples and banqueting halls used for rituals. Those who refused to become Christian were tortured or put to death. By such means, Norse kings and church missionaries brought Christianity to Scandinavia. The far-flung Viking kingdoms also embraced Christianity, often long before their ancestral homelands. The Vikings of northern France became devout Catholics, also earning a new name, Normans, while the Kievan Rus became Eastern Orthodox Christians under Prince Vladimir I. Iceland would be no different, but its story took a much more dramatic turn. Sometime in the 960s, the volcano Eldja erupted, a disaster of terrifying proportions. 4 cubic miles of lava poured out over Iceland, enough to cover England up to the ankles. Tales of the time told of volcanic ash turning the sun blood red, of winters blanketing the land in frost, and cool summers with too little light to ripen the grain. To the Icelanders, it resembled Voluspa, the days that came just before Ragnarok reduced the world to cinders. After this horrific ordeal, it is not surprising that more and more Icelandic Norse took solace in Christianity. By the year 1000, it looked as if civil war would erupt between Icelandic pagans and Christians. So the Althing referred the matter to the law speaker, who mulled the matter over for a day and a night before he proclaimed that Iceland would become Christian. One would think that Christianization of the Vikings would end war between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, but England represented an opportunity. While united, Anglo-Saxon England was one of the richest and most prestigious monarchies in Europe, but much depended on the charismatic role of the king. During the 900s, kingship took on even more mystical and even Christian connotations, with people believing that the king's touch could cure disease and that even his mere presence brought bountiful harvests. However, there was nothing good or godly about the way Ethelred the Unready came to the throne. He was installed by a court faction led by his mother, who murdered Ethelred's half-brother, King Edward the Martyr. Chroniclers, likely adding flourishes to their records after the fact, reported seeing red clouds bursting with fire that floated across the sky on the day that Ethelred's mother put him on the throne. And soon a storm came for real. Word spread that the English had a helpless 12-year-old king under the thumb of quarreling courtiers. The Vikings, some operating illegally as pirates, others with royal commissions in hand, came to devastate the English coast for the first time in almost 2 generations. These were tough professional soldiers who came to enrich both themselves and the treasury of the Danish and Norwegian kings. Ethelred's subjects were stuffed in the holds of Viking longships and taken to be sold in the Kievan Rus. Some of those Vikings themselves were probably Christians, ironically. Ethelred and his court bought off the Vikings, but they only came year after year. In the year 991, a Norwegian fleet led by the future king Olaf Tryggvason sailed up the river Blackwater in Essex. Olaf had 93 ships carrying 5,000 hardened warriors to the tidal reaches where he could easily ambush the river traffic. Their main objective was the fortified river town of Malden, which was home not only to grain stores, but had a strategic location on Northey Island, itself located in the river Blackwater, and it was joined to the mainland by a causeway which spanned the salty marshes of the Blackwater. The Essex Home Guard blocked the causeway on the landward side. As the tide rose, Olaf and his men called across the water to the Anglo-Saxons, urging them to pay up or else. Earl Britnot, the 65-year-old, 6 foot 6 inches commander of the Anglo-Saxons, who was easily distinguished by his shock of white hair, called back that the English had spears for their tribute, and that bitter battle play would be the only thing the Vikings got if they stayed. Olaf then called for the Earl to let them across, so they could fight fair. Whether Britnot hoped to lure the Vikings into a trap, or he acted out of ill-advised chivalry, Earl Britnot backed his Anglo-Saxons away from the causeway and allowed the Vikings to cross. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had been hunting with hawks allowed their birds to perch in the trees before the battle. The birds would be much safer than the Anglo-Saxon peasant militia who were crushed by the hardened veterans of Olaf's army. Britnot himself was wounded by a spear thrust and collapsed. While most of the Anglo-Saxon army fled, a group of Britnot's friends defended their earl's body against capture and mutilation, fighting to the last man. However, their heroic last stand could not change the fact that Malden was a crushing defeat for the Anglo-Saxons. With Olaf's army threatening the whole of South England, King Ethelred the Unready paid Olaf 10,000 pounds of silver to leave England. The Vikings left, probably already planning a return. Priests began to thunder in the pulpit against the irresolution, the incompetence, maybe even the treachery of men around King Ethelred. The author of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, himself likely a priest or bishop, condemned the failures of Ethelred's government in ironic and vicious terms, much like those who fought pro-German appeasers in the years leading up to World War II. For Norse who wanted rewards without wholesale slaughter and the risk of being slaughtered, there were still prospects in the North Atlantic. For example, there was always Greenland, home to a colony of Norse who survived by hunting seals and walruses, trading skins and ivory for amber and animals. One Viking who headed there was Bjarni, who sailed west in 986 from Iceland. However, Bjarni overshot his mark and instead found a land filled with trees that sounded nothing like the descriptions he'd heard of Greenland. In fact, he had found North America, likely the Atlantic coast of what is today Canada. Despite this setback, Bjarni found his way back to Greenland, where his knowledge would be used by another explorer, Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson had grown up in the Greenland colony founded by his father, Eric the Red, almost 20 years prior. In the year 999, he went to his father's ancestral homeland, Norway, then ruled by the devout and ferocious King Olaf. Olaf charged Leif with evangelizing the Greenland Norse, a task Leif happily accepted. And Leif proved to be so successful that he converted his own mother and much of the colony. However, one of the few Leif failed to convert was his father, Eric the Red. Wary of his father's anger, Leif decided to do some exploring while things calmed down. Upon hearing Bjarni's tale of a thickly forested land to the west, Leif bought Bjarni's boat, hired some of his old crew, and went looking for Bjarni's land, doing a little exploring while things calmed down at home. The first land Leif encountered on his journey was a stony beach covered with flat stones, which he imaginatively named Flat Stone Land. He and his sailors headed into the interior, finding themselves in dense pine forests. Showing the same vivid imagination, he called it Forest Land. At last, he found some open meadows and rivers thick with salmon. He and his men found this area to their liking, so they established winter quarters there in the year 1001. During their stay, Leif's men found gooseberries and blackberries, which they fermented into wine, and thus they named this new country Wineland or Vinland. That summer, Leif headed home with a longship filled with gooseberry wine and even rescued some shipwrecked men on his way home. However, when Leif returned home to Greenland, Leif learned that plague had devastated the colony and that his father, Eric the Red, was one of the dead. The Greenland Norse looked to Leif for leadership, and he accepted that his exploring days were over. So Leif turned over the task of settling Vinland to his younger brother Thorvald. Both of the brothers hoped to have the colony become a timber center for Greenland, which had almost no trees, which in turn made building houses and ships very difficult. Thorvald followed his brother's route and found his old winter quarters in the year 1004, feasting on salmon and wine through the winter. That spring, they found out they weren't alone. First they saw the houses, and then they saw the boats turned upside down on the shore. Upon turning over one of the boats, Thorvald's men found 9 men hiding under one of the boats. First contact had just been made between the indigenous peoples of North America and the Vikings. The two groups tried to speak to one another, but with no common words to go on, it's not surprising that violence soon broke out. 8 of the 9 First Nation men were killed, while the 9th made his way back to the village. Upon hearing of the crime, a swarm of First Nation warriors descended upon the Vikings, who fled to their longships as the natives showered them with arrows. Thorvald, as he held his place in the shield wall, took an arrow in the armpit and bled to death on the beach where he planned to build his hull. The expedition went home, but some years later, Norwegian merchants took an interest in Vinland as a source for both timber and wine. However, they only found one person in Greenland who was man enough to return to the hostile country, and that was a woman named FREYDIS. FREYDIS organized a second expedition and found Leif's old camp. This time, she made peace with the natives, trading milk and cheese for squirrel fur. However, when the natives became violently ill from the unfamiliar dairy products, or perhaps fearing more Viking treachery, the First Nation men assaulted the camp. With superior numbers and showers of arrows, the First Nations all but drove the Vikings into the sea. All seemed lost until a pregnant FREYDIS loosed a bull from its pen and it charged into the native army. FREYDIS followed in its hoofprints, bellowing curses and chopping down natives with an iron sword torn from the bloody hand of a dead Viking. Terrified by this horned beast and this madwoman, the natives retreated. The Viking men thanked FREYDIS for her courage by scolding her for being unwomanly. However, FREYDIS did give Vinland colony a chance to survive. They brought in some new men from Norway with an agreement to share profits. Both sides immediately began cheating each other. The Vinlanders and the Norwegians soon split into 2 camps. At last, FREYDIS claimed that the Norwegians assaulted her and forced her husband to invade the Norwegian camp. They murdered the men in their sleep. But when the Vinlanders refused to kill 5 Norwegian women, FREYDIS took an axe and bashed in their heads herself. A few years later, Vinland colony still failed. We don't know why for sure. Was it disease, bad weather, bad luck, more war with the indigenous peoples? We don't know for sure. In any case, around the year 1009, FREYDIS herself returned to Greenland, her reputation somewhat tarnished. While Greenland sailors regularly came to Vinland to cut much-needed timber for their colony, this marked the end of the Viking presence in North America. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.